standing here in Pisgah National Forest in western North Carolina, and this is one of the most biodiverse spots in the entire planet. As you can see behind me, I've got flowing water. This is September of 2016. We're in the middle of a fairly severe drought, but here it's still nice and moist. And the reason being is because it rains a lot here. Where we stand right here is actually one of the rainiest spots in North America. To give you an example of that kind of biodiversity that we're talking about, you know, right here I've got this little seepage slope, I've got this rock, and you can see the water dripping down. Tremendous diversity of mosses growing on this rock, right? The southern Appalachians, particularly here in western North Carolina, where we get so much rain, you have the highest diversity of mosses that you'll find really anywhere in the world, something like 300 different species, right? It stays moist year-round, even in dry years like the late summer of 2016, like what we're dealing with now in this drought. Another example of that type of biodiversity, if you start flipping over rocks in this place, you're going to find salamanders. And in terms of variety and numbers of salamanders, there's really few places on Earth that can rival this area right here. Speaking of diversity, there's also a tremendous diversity of plant species here in the southern Appalachians. Something like 2,500 species of flowering plants, 130, 140 different species of trees, and then of course I mentioned those mosses, 300 to 400 different species of mosses here. And some of these plants are really interesting. This is yellowroot, Xanthorrhiza simplicissima is the Latin name, and of course they call it yellowroot for obvious reasons. It's got this yellow alkaloid compound that's present in the roots that gives it this bright color. You know right away when you dig one up that you're looking at a yellow root. There's also a lot of what we would call endemic species here in the southern Appalachians. Of that large number, some 2,500 species of flowering plants, many of those are only found here in the southern Appalachians, not found anywhere else in the world. We'll take a look at one over here in a minute. It's called mountain pepperbush. So this is one of those endemic species, those species that you find in the southern Appalachians and not anywhere else. This is called mountain pepperbush, Clethra acuminata. You know, it's a tree that doesn't look like much. It might get about 15 feet tall, a couple inches in diameter. It's certainly not impressive from a size standpoint. But if you look at it, it does have some unique features. It's got that flaky brown bark. It's got these unique leaves that have these sunken veins like that. Beautiful, fragrant flowers that you're going to see and smell in the summertime. But again, it's a species that you only find here in the southern Appalachians across just a couple of states. If you look up above, you can see another endemic species to the southern and central Appalachians. That's called Fraser magnolia. The Latin on that one is Magnolia fraseri. It's a tree that you'll note when you see it. It's got a really unique leaf. I think we got some pictures of it. It reminds me of one of those goldfish crackers. It has sort of a tail here at the back, these two little lobes there at the base. Very different from some of the other magnolias that you might be familiar with, like the southern magnolia that's more common towards the coast. But again, this is a species that you only find really here in the central and southern Appalachians. You find it in these cove type forests where it's fairly moist and typically very diverse, a lot of other species as well. So we're up here about 5,000 feet above sea level, just off the Blue Ridge Parkway on this rocky outcrop here in Pisgah National Forest. And we're here in this little patch of woods with an overstory that's dominated by northern red oak. Right? We've got some trees here that are 60 or 70 feet tall, maybe a foot and a half in diameter. Some beautiful, gnarly old trees with these twisted trunks covered with mosses and lichens and things like that. Just a beautiful forest. But what we're interested here is not those big overstory trees, but rather these smaller mid-story and understory trees, particularly this one right here. This is the American chestnut. Right? Back in the day, 100 or more years ago, the American chestnuts would have dwarfed these northern red oaks. American chestnut used to be a massive tree, well over 100 feet tall in some cases, several feet in diameter, and you would find it in these well-drained rocky sites throughout the southern Appalachians and Piedmont. In the early part of the 20th century, however, there was a fungal disease, it's called chestnut blight, that came in from Asia, and it infected the chestnut trees, and over the course of a few decades, more or less wiped them out. So now we're looking at a species that we're really lucky to find one that's even this big. Right? This one's, you know, 4 inches or so in diameter, maybe 30 or 40 feet tall. That's a big chestnut nowadays, because what happens is they get about this big, they get infected with the blight and they fall over, right? So from the early to the middle part of the 20th century, the American chestnut, which was one of the dominant trees in the southern and central Appalachians, was essentially eliminated from the landscape. You still find these giant chestnut logs laying around. If you find a chestnut nowadays, you'll be lucky if it's this big. More commonly, it's going to be about this big, a small little shrubby resprout growing up in the understory. Again, it's going to grow up it's going to get infected with the blight and it's going to die. So effectively what we're looking at here is a species that's functionally extinct. So when you get up above 5,000 feet in elevation here in the southern Appalachians, you're dealing with sites that spend a lot of time in the clouds. So even if even if it's fairly rocky and poor soils, there's a lot of moisture and you see a lot of stuff growing in the understory in these types of sites. Take a look at this. This is called the Indian cucumber root. It's got this beautiful display of sort of reds and greens. You can actually dig it up and it's got a tuber-like root that's edible. Tastes kind of like a cucumber. If you look down here, this species right here is called galax, this little round-leaved species. This is a species that maybe you recognize from the floral industry. If you've ever bought a bouquet of flowers, folks like to use galax as an ornamental species in the floral industry because it stays green long after you cut it. These higher elevations, you also get a lot of different species of trillium. You see this trillium right here. These flower early in the year. That flower has already kind of petered out, but you do see quite a lot of trillium here in the understory. So when most folks think about fall foliage, they're mainly thinking about leaves, right? The beautiful maples and the dogwoods and the oaks that bring on that beautiful display of yellows and oranges and reds this time of year. But there's really more to fall color than that. If you look around, you see a lot of color in things other than leaves, right? We've got these beautiful fall wildflowers, these different asters and other species. And then if you look behind me, that's a species called mountain ash. Mountain ash is not a true ash, but we call it mountain ash because it's kind of similar, the leaf morphology, to an ash. But the really striking thing about mountain ash this time of year is those clusters of bright red fruits that you see. And you see those bright red fruits. If it wasn't so foggy out today, this high vista that we have here up about 6,000 feet, you would see mountain ash all over the place. That'd be the brightest color you see this time of year.